It's MH370. Until you do some research, don't talk to me. I'm going to find the truth while I sip this martini. Your opinion, it means squat to me. It's H370. Not all heroes wear capes. I wear glasses to see. I'm going to find the truth while I sip this martini. The trolls hate seeing me succeed, but guess what? H370.
Welcome, everybody, to this special episode of Hard Truths Podcast. This is Sunday. I'm your host, Ashton Forbes. Today, I have a special guest, Dave Rossi, my good friend. I'm bringing him on right now. Hello, sir. How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing good, brother. Thank you so much. How are you?
Doing great, man. So I'm so happy to have you on here. If people are not familiar with Brother Dave here, he is a DoD contractor and engineer. That means he works on private contracts that are out there. He has a lot of extensive knowledge about physics and electrical engineering. And if you've been following the streams that I've been doing over the last week or two, you've seen that we've gone into a lot of these Defense Intelligence Agency papers. So what I wanted to do was bring Dave on here today to go through those papers and to go through the MH370 videos today in this very special episode. So, Dave, first thing I wanted to ask you is, are you familiar with these Defense Intelligence Agency papers that are out there? And how long have you known about them? And what do you think about why they exist in general?
Sure. Thank you. Well, first off, thank you so much for having me on. I love the vibe that not just you bring, brother, but also that your audience brings. I love reading the chat too here, and I just want to say hello to everybody. For those that have come from my neck of the woods, thank you so much for hopping on to Ashton's stream. And as it pertains to the DIA papers, I am extremely familiar with them, very well versed in them, and I've known about them. I had read the papers probably within 3 or 4 days of it being released on the DIA's website. I think this was 2 to 3 years back, maybe 2.5 years ago, I think it was. And I think they're what these papers suggest. I mean, keep in mind that the papers were contracted by the DIA to essentially look, I think, anywhere from 20 to 50 years into the future with regards to various forms of propulsion, communication, and things like that. With that said, I would say that these papers are describing things that secretly have been developed and matured quite some time ago. Now, without getting into a whole, backstory and whatnot, I know that much of your audience knows this, but I would say that a lot of what these DIA papers cover, both conceptually and to a large extent practically, plus or minus a couple of areas in the engineering side, were probably matured, I'd say, by the 50s or 60s. And I know that's a bold statement to make. I know that's a large claim to make. But if we look, for example, at a lot of the work at Sperry Rand Corporation in conjunction with the Navy and General Electric going all the way back to the 1930s, we know, for example, that the usage of Tesla's technology was, in fact, utilized in various forms of network analyzers for the Navy, And electrical engineers were, even at the time, seemed to be far more prominent in being able to make some certain aspects of this work in conjunction with people like Bondi, DeWitt, Einstein, Niels Bohr, and so on and so forth. So these papers are fantastic. And I think that they really represent something that is that connects to both your work as well as Mr. Paez's work and many others.
Yeah. So why do you think that they like the dates on the publish year are like, I think they're all 2010. And I think that's when they were published. I don't know when they were exactly declassified or unclassified. Why do you think that they were only published in 2010 if the science goes back to the 50s and 60s?
Well, I think what we're dealing with here is we have to realize that the effort from the DIA papers was part of a larger effort. Now, what I'm about to say here can get controversial, so I'm not claiming to support nor go against or attack what I'm about to the individuals involved here. But if we look at this bigger apparatus of what was going on, we know that those papers were contracted by from the DIA to Bigelow Advanced Aerospace Space Studies. And so when we look at that scenario, we see that BASS at the time, BASS is short for Bigelow Aerospace, was at least seeming to attempt, whether for personal proprietary gain or for the betterment of humanity, is not for me to say, I really don't know. But it seemed like there was an attempt to bring a lot of these conceptual understandings and theoretical foundations forward in ways that other groups were not. And I think what we saw there essentially was that what these papers were written about discussed concepts and topics that would have been considered highly sensitive and classified probably post World War II, Nazi Germany. And I know this because, without getting into any specific names, for my own safety, there are individuals that have since passed away, but individuals that worked with the Germans both during and post World War II in an engineering sense to make a lot of the phenomenon discussed in the DIA papers come to fruition after in the 1950s, 60s, and so on. And so I think what we saw with the 2009, 2010 publication of the papers, even in a classified sense, was a grander picture of essentially saying this stuff is there in the classified setting, and how can we bring some of it into a commercialized setting, or some type of setting in which, for example, you would have the Saudi Arabian energy system underwrite a lot of what those energy principles entail, and then try and bring it out in that regard. Now, that is my understanding, and so we have to look at it as more of a 70, 80 year type of big picture thing. But does that answer your question? 2009?
Yeah, I guess what I'm kind of getting at is, do you think there's some element of plausible deniability where they can, like, if this technology were to come out, they could go, hey, no, we had these papers. We told you that they were out there. I mean, we had all these DIA papers that say that we were working on it. Like, do you think there's an element to that?
Absolutely. This is how one can play both sides against the middle. Again, rules for thee, not for me. So what you do is you publish a paper like what we see with the DIA, and then you have a handful of scientists that may or may not have contributed to the publication and writing of those papers, or authoring some of those papers. We have those certain scientists would come out and now say, no, well, the theory is there, but there's no way to practically engineer it. It's impossible, But then if there is a sudden breakthrough that just so happens to favor the ones that are trying to keep control of this type of understanding of energy and technology and physics, they can still then say, well, the theory was there, so it was only a matter of time till we engineered it. And so it can go, you can play it both ways and swing it either way.
Yeah. So I think let's get to it. First of all, I'm wearing my shirt today. MH370 didn't disappear itself. Now we're going to look at the MH370 videos here. And I want to kind of put this disclaimer out there that we're going to look at them from the perspective that they are authentic. We also have plausible deniability. No one has told us whether or not these videos are real. If they are, they're probably classified videos. But we are going to look at them through the lens of these papers and the science that is out there that may be non-conventional. So we are looking at them through the agreed upon laws of physics, but we are potentially looking at those laws of physics through a different lens, the lens of, potentially concepts that Tesla brought forward. And then we're going to look at all those papers after and figure out how it kind of those papers line up with what we're seeing in these videos. So are you ready to take a look?
Absolutely.
Okay, here we go. Let me pull up. We're going to start with the satellite video. And this is the highest quality version of the satellite video. This was published later on in the summer. I did a post earlier today that this version, since it's higher quality, Regicytonin's version is lower quality, and you can't see the coordinates as well in the Regicytonin version, which would indicate that Regicide Anon was not the original source of these videos, that both of these sources got them from a third party that's out there, which I think is really strong evidence they're real, because Regicide Anon says they received this video March 12th, 2014, only 4 days after the plane went missing, which is practically impossible for somebody to hoax something like this. Now, let's go ahead and play it. Take a look. You can see the coordinates in the bottom left. We can see this plane scaled down, accurate capabilities of a 777-200. We can see smoke. We can see what looks like a Citrix session or remote terminal login. And then here comes our first orb right out of the top side of the screen. Now, one thing I've started to notice about this is this speed of this orb when it comes in, we calculated to be somewhere around like 2,000 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And what I've been calling these is a hypersonic weapon, because when I Googled hypersonic weapons, I found out that these hypersonic weapons have a plasma sheath in front of them. And supposedly that's how they get through the issue of having friction in air. Would you agree or have any comment on the idea that like plasma physics has a major component to this type of technology, or the idea of this technology that we have?
Without a shadow of a doubt, absolutely. I would actually say that I can say his name now because I know he has passed away. But there was an individual, I think, based out of Germany that did specialized in this type of notion of basically a plasma sheath in combination with various forms of crystal experiments. And his name was Thorsten von Ludwig. And he was contracted quite often by various DoD agencies and contractors to develop things like plasma sheath and other aspects of this type of technology. So I would fully agree with you. I mean, one other thing that I would like to mention as well is that what we're dealing with when we talk about things like, you know, negative energy or vacuum polarization or creating a gradients in the space-time metric to develop one's own axial geodesic and so on and so forth, or even using, you know, the strong nuclear force and resonance to amplify these effects, or direct energy weapons and so on. This is all the same underlying zero-point energy science that tends to conflate over and overlaps into various areas. So one aspect of negative energy with enough energy density applied to it could in fact enable things, for example, like low energy nuclear reaction cold fusion. And so we start crossing over into these various areas in which there have been stories in the past where individuals developing free energy devices or over unity devices, meaning, you know, you get more out than what you put in fact, also begin to lose their weight if the voltage induced within the current and voltage was scaled up significantly. And so we start to realize that it's almost as if nature is geometric. And we know this because quite often there's something that is recommended behind the scenes to individuals looking into this, which is a book by John Wheeler called Geometrodynamics, essentially unifying geometry and quantum electrodynamics, as Sal Paez has also mentioned. And even what those discuss in those books is that there is this, in electrical engineering, we know we have the right-hand rule, but we also have what has not been taught in schools, a left-hand rule, or what we could also call an anti-right-hand rule. This is what gives rise to right-angle vectors, and this is also what gives rise to the notion of inducing orthogonality and perpendicularity within the vacuum. And so, in other words, the least I could say is yes, I agree with you fully. And the most I could say is that it conflates, and in a Venn diagram sense, it overlaps into various areas of basically every field of science, chemistry, all of it.
Yeah, it's funny because, I'm trying to bring it down to earth for everybody who's out there and watching. But I remember the first time we spoke, I had no idea what you and Sal were talking about. You can probably tell when you look at my facial expression.
But now you know.
And now 6 months later,
Yes.
the stuff you're saying actually makes sense to me now. And when we're talking about like the geometries, we're talking about the geometries potentially of space-time itself. And this doesn't mean like everything in the universe is connected, but there are aspects where like this technology is a Pandora's box, where once you open it up, now you realize there's all these different applications. Low energy nuclear reactions is one of them. And that can be how we produce these exotic vacuum objects, gravity manipulation. So let's go back to the videos here for a minute, because there's an interesting thing happening in these videos, which is this first orb doesn't quite lock in right away. You see it spin around the plane to the left, and then it locks in. You see the second orb come in, and the second orb locks in almost instantly. And I did some timings on this, and there's like about a 5-second difference between the first orb getting there and the second orb. But after the second orb gets there, the third orb comes in within 2 seconds and connects and finishes the triangle. And you can tell right here, they're not creating a 0-point system that's like a line. They're creating like 2 edges of the triangle of the equilateral triangle 0-point system. And then the
Right.
third orb comes in right away. And right
Well,
here, when we first spoke, I wasn't sure what was going on here with this orientation spin around the plane.
yeah.
But now I'm pretty much certain that what they're doing here is they're trying to figure out exactly how big the singularity they're going to induce here has to be in order to encompass the plane. Do you have any thoughts?
I do actually. I hope you don't mind, I brought a pen and paper here, some sketches
Oh,
I'd
yeah.
like to show. So one of the things that now that you have more of a very fantastic understanding of this, so one of the things I will say is that the orbs and some of the stuff I'm going to say here to some may seem quite far-fetched, to others it may not. You may find me jumping between esoteric postulations and known condensed matter physics laws and things like that. But with that said, the notion of the three orbs being there, we talked in the past, I think late last year, early this year, about a fourth orb being at the place in which, if there was a teleportation event, the fourth orb would have to be at the place in which they would want the plane to go, assuming it's a teleportation event and not an endothermic or exothermic event. With that said, what really gets interesting is that we talk about this notion of completing a quadrupole, right? Which is, again, two dipoles overlapping each other. But what's interesting is that when we notice the three orbs surround the plane, we notice that the number 3, like Tesla always mentioned, 369 is very significant. But this also directly correlates to a different type of, dare I say, understanding of mathematics with regards to Pythagoras' theorem, the notion of 2 to 1. And the reason I bring that up is because it's almost as if the orbs themselves were trying to develop a sort of Ankh-like scenario or a bifurcation apparatus, geometrical bifurcation, which would be a fancy way of essentially saying inducing a fractal moment, as even Bob Greenyer mentions. Now, what's interesting is that when we look at this geometrically, it's almost as if, for example, let's just say we had one orb on each one here. Say this was a positive and a positive, and it's almost as if this orb, the third orb, was a negative orb, to then bring the plane in which it's surrounded to where the fourth orb was. And the fourth orb would be negative as well. So now it's not a perfect X because geodesics can be perturbed and so on. But essentially what we're seeing is the crossover of two different dipoles. And we know that from an astrophysical scale, it's been proposed that gravitons could be emitted even from planetary bodies, even at small or large density levels, by oscillating the mass of a quadrupole. And so I would say very firmly that is what these orbs are doing in conjunction with much of what has been talked about in recent from others. For example, I do very strongly agree, with Dr. Jack Sarfati, when he says, for example, that plasma can slow down c, or the speed of light. This is something that I have not really, I don't think, elaborated as much or as clearly as he has in the past. But this notion that plasma or a Bose-Einstein condensate can essentially act as a, so imagine the ether right now, or the quantum vacuum or empty space. Let's call it the ether. Imagine all around us, we have all of these particle fluctuations moving super quickly, but they're all moving at light speed. So how can you snatch it? It's like when you're trying to grab the handle of a door, but the door keeps moving and you can't get it. What plasma does, and what a Bose-Einstein condensate does, is it essentially slows down that doorway that's always been around you, but it's just been moving too fast for you to grab it. And so plasma essentially slows down that doorway so you can basically grab that door handle and open it. Now, translating that to practicality would be basically breaking down the symmetry of the vacuum, of the local, or of the ether, essentially. So the idea being that you would be inducing a form of negative energy. So
yeah, and we're going to talk a lot more about that when we look at the papers here. So
yeah,
and then just again from a high level perspective, we see this, that the orbs are clearly doing this mapping. And then to your point about the right hand rule, you can see them reorient right there, which this is not an accident. This is not somebody just guessing at what they should look like. If you were to look at the plane straight forward right here, they would be spinning clockwise. And if you use the right hand rule, you can create your vector, and your vector is going to be pointing backwards from the where the plane's trajectory was. And we were able to map out the direction of travel based on those coordinates we see in the bottom left.
yeah.
And it shows that this plane is currently going somewhat east when we see this plane flying. So if it's going backwards, it's going to go over to the west. And we went ahead and we pulled up. We did like a proposed route to figure out where that would potentially go.
Right.
And what we found out here is that it goes somewhere over near the Maldives. And more so than that here, you can see that if I zoom this in, let me see. I'll zoom in a little bit. So this plane is seen by a witness right here where we have the coordinates. And then if it goes over to the west, turns out there was a B777 fire suppression device that was empty that washes up in one of these islands like a week or two later. And we have on this small island called Kuda Huvaduvau, I'm butchering that.
Kuda Huvadu, I think it's
Kuda Huvadu. There was like
Yeah.
20 islanders that see this plane in the early morning hours, and it was discounted because the direction of travel had the plane coming from the west. And they thought, well, if it came from the east, it should have come from the east. So they just ignored it, even though the islanders saw steam coming out of the back of the plane.
right.
And they also saw the red and white stripe of Malaysian Airlines. And they said that they saw the plane flying south. And if you just scroll down, what do you get if you go to the south? Oh, there's a secret military base there. That's a great spot in the middle of the Indian Ocean to hide an aircraft.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
but
Well, the one thing I wanted to mention as well, too, is that I saw some comments even earlier, probably 15, 20 minutes ago, about people asking if the fire on the plane, if I thought it was premeditated. I would say certainly, because again, when you, this is metaphorically and literally, when you bring someone or something down yourself, you control the way it happens, whether that is someone's public image when you're trying to do a damage control, or whether that is literally when you're trying to bring a plane down or have control a plane's momentum, velocity, and speed so that you can do what was done here, allegedly in this footage. And so I would say certainly that the orbs, without a shadow of a doubt, induced a form of a direct energy weapon. And people might say, well, okay, where would the heat signatures be of that event, right? And to that, I would say, well, we have to understand that when we're dealing with what we call negative energy, we're dealing with both a negentropic and an anti-thermodynamic state, which essentially means that all of our radars and detectors, which are normally made to pick up heat for heat signatures, will not be able to detect the complete reverse aspect of that, because what we're essentially dealing with in this case are cold currents, or basically very cold electric waves, to the point in which they could actually freeze or your finger if you touched it in the laboratory or something like that. But that would be another aspect. So again, we are only as good as the detectors in which we make. And so I think that's also another reason why, for those that may say, well, Dave, if you think it's premeditated, where's the laser beam hitting the, oh, there we go. Perfect. There we go. So even that's perfectly shown. Okay, that would be a perfect example of the direct energy weapon result, where the beam itself, say from, deployed from the orb, let's just say hypothetically it's shooting the orb, one of the orbs is shooting a beam at the plane. The beam itself would be cold, but then the result of that, of whatever it's burning up or what have you, will start to show the signatures we see there. So I would say that there's certainly something there. We've seen, for example, even Ken Shoulders do some work in the laboratory pertaining to a different type of electricity that was, phenomenological, that was able to cut through stone. And I can get the paper for you on that afterwards, but yeah.
And I have a slightly different take on it, which is that there's these batteries on board the plane. And people ask, were they accidental or was it intentional? I think if this is an operation and we see this drone very close to the plane in the very beginning of this video, this is set up from the beginning. This is an operation.
Right.
I would speculate that if they used a directed energy weapon, they used it on the plane when the plane went dark initially, and they ignited the batteries. And then what we're seeing here is the smoke from the fire within the cargo bays going through the air conditioning system and out through the air conditioning ducts here. And this is where you see this smoke trail come right out of that location, potentially just wrapping around the hull of the plane here to produce that smoke. And then we do see the cold lines in front of the orbs. We actually can see it pretty clearly, especially right beforehand. Now, in this version of the video, it's harder to see, but these dark lines here are actually pulling these orbs forward. That's that geodesic as well that we're seeing. And then to your point about low energy nuclear reactions, this is where Bob Greenier's got his video that says, like, I didn't make these videos and I didn't go back in time. That's what he says. Because what we're looking at here is that Thor's hammer here, which he says, this is where they're changing the permittivity of free space. So this video to me is the one where it's like, who the hell made this? And how would they have the knowledge that nobody at the time in 2014 outside of the black world would have any idea about?
And this is where I would even go as far as to say that if we had detectors that were able to pick up the negative aspect of this low energy nuclear reaction angle, would actually be able to see far more of a protrusion surrounding the orbs around them and so on and so forth. But I'm fully with you on all of that. Yes, 100%. This all lines up with the different aspects of what this entails. Yep.
And then the part two here is that a lot of this goes back to Tom Bearden. And I want to
Mhm.
ask you about him in a second. But when we see this event happen, I mean, the way it zooms out here tells me this person is expecting this to happen. They zoom in, we're getting the best intelligence. I would
Yeah.
speculate based on seeing this isn't our first rodeo at this kind of thing. But my
No.
guess is as well is that we're filming this to get better intelligence on how it operates so that we can improve it in the future, if I had to guess.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So if I could say quickly, a lot of this goes right back to what Tom Bearden had discussed, including, of course, the work by Nikola Tesla. Now, one of the things I'll say that may be controversial or maybe not is that there was allegedly testing of Tesla's interferometry experiments going all the way back to World War I, allegedly. Now, there's some documentation providing this. There are some newspaper articles and so on that match up with the dates of the time in relation to World War I. But more and most importantly, we see that after World War II, the likes of people such as Lieutenant Colonel Tom Bearden were doing their best, particularly I think in their later years of their lives, to try and help people develop an understanding of how this works, so that people can then demand more transparency from their leaders and so on and so forth, so as to be able to understand that these things are possible without a shadow of a doubt. Tom Bearden was someone who I have immense admiration for, and someone who really was decades ahead of his time. And really, I have much respect for him because he really went out on a limb, and he went through a lot of personal sacrifices just to try and essentially get the message out. And this was before the era of the internet. I know he had done some things on the web a little bit, but yeah.
Yeah, and the Thomas Bearden stuff, I mean, I watched like all of the videos I could find on him. And when he's talking about the cold explosions, I can't think of any other time where we've seen a cold explosion, an endothermic event, other
Right.
than this video. Like these
Yeah.
videos, this one particularly, might be the only human record of endothermic event that we have in the public purview. That's at
Right.
least of this high quality. I mean, we see it right there. That right there. That
I
is a
can get
cold endothermic event.
if I could say as well, for example, this notion of an endothermic event, there have been in private laboratories experiments, for example, where, and I think I may have brought this up before, if you take, because what this physics does is it dramatically increases, it opens up a vast amount of new types of physics in chemistry amongst all the other fields. But say you take an acid and you take a hydroxide and you neutralize the two in a petri dish, and from that neutralization, you're normally expected to get some type of exothermic reaction. Normally, you're supposed to get some type of heat. But in this particular instance, there is no heat after you neutralize the two substances in the petri dish, right? And so what that tells you is that there are some peculiar properties in that particular acid and that particular hydroxide in which it's possible the internal structures of those of the acid and hydroxide are enabled in such a way that they've actually implemented the open system or the ether in conjunction with its boundary conditions. So in other words, what that basically means is instead of actually observing the heat dissipate from the neutralization in the laboratory, the heat itself is actually transferred in the form of other types of energy, such as mass or resonance, that then just sort of simmers off into the ether in a way that normally, again, we would be cold and not hot.
Yeah, and Thomas Bearden talks about the scalar interferometry as well. So taking your scalar transmitters, and at one point I remember specifically he brings up the idea of 0-point system for your pump waves. And then he
Right.
goes like this in the video, and then he goes like this. And when he did the triangle formation, that's when I went, oh my goodness, that's what we're looking at here. Kind of like what
Right.
you just showed in your diagram a second ago as well.
Right. It's the very basic visual of the notion that our models currently publicly are based on a flat space time, and I would say that a lot of the DIA papers are basing it on basing those physics discussed in the papers on a semi-classical, so a flat but also curved space time. But they kind of they watch the way in which they write the equation, so you have to kind of go in knowing when you go into these papers what they're kind of grasping. They won't explicitly state it, but basically, yes, it's a flat space time in which one then makes a peak in that space time. Now that peak could be, triangular, it could be curved. I know, quite often we speak more about curving space time, of course. But yeah, that's what that is. Absolutely.
Yeah, these videos are very exciting, and I want to give Dave credit for two concepts that he's helped out with in the past that I did not previously understand. One was the fourth orb. So the idea
Mm,
of like, how do we determine the direction of travel? And I think that I like both you and Bob Greenyer have very similar approaches to it.
yes,
Bob Greenyer would say, well, we just turn it on and then we turn it off, and that the
right,
right hand rule can still dictate the direction of travel. Now, in yours, I like your theory a little bit more because I like the idea of having a steering wheel. And this is one
right,
where the orb can theoretically be anywhere, but I do think that it's probably somewhere back near the Maldives. And when I look at this technology too, a lot of people look at this and they go, we can't understand this. And I would say, yes, we can understand it, but it even goes a step further than that, that this is not like the absolute pinnacle of this technology. Like this is
right,
us just figuring it out. And we're
yes,
trying to figure out how to improve it, but we can potentially improve it like a ton. I can imagine in the future, you could have warp gates, or you could have a situation where you can just send this plane anywhere you want. But for now, maybe we're limited to sending it somewhere else on Earth or somewhere else where we have another orb as the direction of travel. And that's the part where I want people to think like, this is just the beginning. Like this could get way crazier.
right, right. I can tell you, yeah, yeah, very much so. It's interesting to see what's happening right now because I'm having conversations with many individuals and groups and committees behind the scenes that again they're kind of pulling what I call a Sean Kirkpatrick. They're saying one thing in these private calls, but then another thing publicly, and it's very unfortunate because I do really believe that there's a way that a lot of this stuff can be developed and commercialized in a way that there's enough money for everyone to go around, whether it's on the big level or the small level. And I understand the need to keep various aspects of this secret, but I mean, we're at a point now in which you and I discussed privately as well that it's getting very difficult to progress physics and science overall without having to reveal a lot of this. And so that's why I must say that although I don't agree with him on everything, I agree very strongly with Eric Weinstein when he says quantum physics is like a startup company that never ships a product. I say arguably that was kind of the point. People keep
Yeah.
running in circles. Yeah.
And I want to go ahead and say, people will say, well, why are they doing this? Why would you do this? And of course, only the United States government could give us the official answer. But
Yeah.
as somebody who probably knows more about these videos than anyone on the planet, what I would say is that this is related to the 20 free-scale semiconductor scientists on board this plane. It's way too many people. Semiconductors, superconductivity are all over this kind of technology. When you imagine these microchips and making them smaller, they had just released a microchip that was the size of smaller than a dimple in a golf ball. They had also had a patent for maximizing the number of dyes on a wafer or something like that, which I don't even fully understand. But when you look at superconductivity, especially the LK99 stuff recently, you see rocks just floating freely with the magnets like moving all around them. And you look at this and you go, that's got to be related to it. Do you have any comment or thoughts on that?
I do, and as we talked about privately, there's quite a few things that unfortunately I can't say, but and I really apologize to the audience for that because I'm not trying to lead anybody on or anything, but the semiconductor aspect is very crucial, whether it's superconductors or the notion of room temperature superconductivity occurring. As you know, I firmly believe that I would go as far as to say that I know, and I wouldn't expect anyone to just blindly believe me, but I know that, for example, basic material like aluminum or gold can actually become superconductive if certain things are done to that material. Now, yes, the procedures that will need to be done to those materials are not something that could be done at home, but certainly something that with the right resources could enable room temperature superconductivity. Now, the reason I bring that up is because if we think about the way in which semiconductors work, which is that, again, they're very basic devices that both conduct electricity but also don't. So they have a dielectric element to them, but they also have insulators and barriers that stop electrical flow and charge. We have to ask ourselves, well, if we talk about this notion about quantum physics occurring within the quantum scale, basically at the Planck level in which the smallest forms of matter exist, we have to ask ourselves, could it be possible that these semiconductors find a way to couple to this Planck scale? And the reason I bring that up is because if we can couple to the Planck scale, it may be possible then to use resonance to amplify the effects in which the coupling picks up at that Planck scale. And so and we know, by the way, publicly, that there's a very, very weak coupling between electromagnetism and gravity on the Planck scale. And so the coupling is there, but the amplification is the problem. And so it's possible that a lot of these semiconductor scientists knew ways in which to amplify some of these effects. Whether these effects were propulsion related or healing related or what have you, that I really I can't say. Not because I know, I genuinely don't know, but because there's so many areas you can dive into to explore in this field. I mean, it never ends. Biophysics, the brain, it keeps going. So I think certainly, without a shadow of a doubt, I am of the humble view that if there was an attempt to send a message to other countries via an intelligence apparatus or unofficial channels, basically saying, "Look at us. This is what we have. Don't mess with us." I really see no better way than to do something like this.
Yeah, to me, that's what this is. This is a message. This is a warning to people. And when I dug into intellectual property theft, the number one target
Mm,
are foreign nationals that work for American companies,
right.
and China steals like $600 billion worth of intellectual property. And
I
if
remember John McAfee before he passed away. Sorry, on a Reddit AMA, he had a very good
Mm.
description of terrible for us, but great for the Chinese in terms of the methods and strategies used in the ways in which Chinese university students are sent here to North America as foreign students, and the way that they get into these programs or these databases is very sophisticated. But again, it's an attempt to constantly bring. Bring information back to China. If there's one thing I could say from a historical perspective, and I know that this is not in any official history record, but it's as I understand it to be, which is that after World War II, and after the nuclear bomb was dropped, Stalin had told and I think Bearden had told this story in the past. Stalin had basically told, and I'm paraphrasing here, he gathered all of his best scientists from all the institutes across the Soviet Union. So at the time, you're talking about, Belarus, Latvia. You're not just talking about Russia. You're talking about all of these countries, Eastern European countries. And he basically said, ladies and gentlemen, to the scientists, the first great scientific revolution was American, but I can assure you that the next one is going to be Soviet. And so what he then did was he then had all of his intelligence agencies, and he also had all of his best scientists essentially go to America and Europe, load up all the literature on everything, chemistry, you name it, loaded up on literally on boats, like loaded up books on boats and shipped it back to Russia. And they set up very sophisticated translation institutes, and they went over the literature with a fine a fine comb, and they looked for anything and everything they could. And that is why quite often the Soviets are attributed to having a much more better understanding, maybe more back then than now, of this notion of bioenergetics, psychoenergetics, psychotronics, direct energy weapons, and so on and so forth. I certainly think there's something there, and I think to this day, the Russians are some of the best nonlinear, non-commutative, non-abelian mathematicians I've ever seen personally. I mean, they're even far more open about their discussion on gravitons. If you just type in, Russian publications, University of Moscow or what have you, on graviton generation and so on and so forth, the papers are out there.
Yeah, and I remember listening to Thomas Bearden talk about that, and it
Right.
would not surprise me if they were ahead of us in like the 70s and 80s, maybe in the 60s, and that when the fall of the Soviet Union happened, economics is the biggest downfall for that, and so I think that's possibly where we caught up. And
Right.
like the weird letter to me mentions, it feels like in the 2000s when quantum computers started getting figured out, supercomputers. That's
Yeah.
how, to me, you move from like radar dishes or even satellites using interferometry to now
Yeah.
you've got floaty orbs that can do it, like we see in this video. And I'm showing these videos again. This is one where it's some color changed versions that I slowed down and put in here just to show people how much
Yeah.
detail are in these videos. These videos, in my mind, no doubt whatsoever, are real. Far too intricate,
If
far
I
too
could,
much science that goes into them.
brother, if I could jump in, I saw someone in the comments here say,
Yeah.
didn't Lazar say gravitons are nonsense and that gravity is mainly two types of waves, grav A and grav B? I would actually agree with all of that in the sense that I believe there's two types of gravity. We have AC gravity, alternating current gravity, and then we have DC gravity. So DC gravity is static, and then AC gravity is essentially a fluctuation effect that we see, like, for example, in the way that a sinusoidal wave was mapped out by these orbs here. Gravitons themselves are both particles and waves simultaneously. It's a nonlinear effect, and they cannot be, when you emit a graviton in the laboratory, they do have a, how can I put this? They do go faster than light, and they also cannot be seen by the human eye. They essentially exist in a form of hyperspace because they act as a spin 2 boson particle. And so you see the effects of the graviton, but you don't actually see you can't, at least with the naked eye, you can't see the traveling wave or the traveling particle, if you will. But yes, a great question too. Purposeful porpoise, I think that's your username there.
Yeah, and I wanted to show as well the those graphs that you're showing, just to show people, and also
Sure.
this video right here. This is actually a GIF right here.
Oh, cool.
That actually shows the similar tracking to what we see in the drone video as well here.
Mm.
I'll just show actually the full video that I've got, because to me, like, we think we found the camera exactly here. This is this MX25 camera here. And it's got the exact capabilities that we need. It's got EO and IR. It's got color. It's got nighttime vision capabilities. We found this on a YouTube channel where it was uploaded 2015. And we can actually see in the top left here, this was taken July 15th, 2014. So these potentially would have been the exact types of cameras. This is exact kind of tracking that we see in the MH370 drone video, where it's manual. And we don't see the huge heat signature underneath this plane, consistent with what we see with the engines here. Now, this is a much lower altitude than what our plane is potentially at, but we can then, this kind of helps us to compare to that drone video to see it's got very similar capabilities. And then the pattern of the orbs is really interesting.
So I'm so sorry to cut you off, brother. If you want to keep going, and then if I could just, when you're done, if I could reply to a couple of great questions from your audience here.
Yeah, sure. So this was from a very old Reddit post before the whole thing got banned off of Reddit in August. And it was the graphical mapping of the orbs. And to me, this here is like, who is coming up with this? You can tell this is very realistic in terms of these lines in the beginning are when they're kind of linking up to the plane. And then they get into the orientation. And then they have this perfect waveform pattern that you see here, which is far too exact in my mind for anyone to be flying in these. This is why it's not aliens or humans inside these little orbs. Like, this is some kind of computer program or automatic homing or tracking system that they're using. And it's consistent with a 3-phase, 120 degrees 0 points electrical system, which, again, so now you think of all the list of requirements to fake these. Some VFX expert that knew about where the plane was before the world knew, that also knew about, like, Thomas Bearden and Tesla science, that's still consistent with electrical engineering.
If I could say very quickly, that other gentleman, the former Marine who claimed in, I think, where was it? What was that country he was in which he claimed that, Indonesia, in which he saw that craft, and then those private contractors made them get on their knees.
Was it Michael Herrera?
Herrera, thank you. Mr. Herrera had even stated that he heard sort of like an electrical transformer hum coming from the craft when it was close to the ground. And so we notice this reoccurrence, whether it's a sine wave in Ashton's analysis of the videos, or whether it's this notion of an electrical hum, so to speak. We know there's something there with electricity that clearly has not been taught in schools, without a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah, and I find it very unlikely. And I found this old Reddit comment. And the reason why this Reddit comment was interesting to me is that this Reddit comment was from early August. And in early August, even up till about September, I was sure we were looking at an annihilation event. I thought that wormholes weren't possible or anything like that. And this was me because I knew nothing about it. And then I find all these scientific papers about humanly traversable wormholes. And I'm like, they are possible. And then I talk to you, and I'm like, okay, now actually I do think it's a teleportation warp drive type event that we're going to look into. And this person, some of the people in the comments were like, this is exactly what you would expect it to look like. Here's how it would rotate. Here's how the right hand rule works. That this might be a literal wormhole generator. And I actually have, when we look at these scientific papers in a few minutes, a couple links where I think that I want to get your opinion, because it seems like they're kind of explaining this type of catapult type effect that we see here, which is this rubber band effect of the fourth orb and slingshotting it over. So I just thought this was very interesting to see that, because people were on it. People had it figured out even way back then in terms of what we were potentially looking at in these videos. And I don't think there's ever been any kind of hoax videos or even UFO videos that are this detailed, that are this accurate to the science. where real engineers like you, Salvatore Paez, shout out to him, look at them and are like, hey, we need to talk. We need to talk about some of these concepts that are out there, right?
Well,
Pretty wild.
I couldn't agree more, and I thank you for that. I don't put myself next to Sal. Sal is that incredible, but yeah, 100%. I would say that when you look at all of the aspects of this, there's the more time goes on, the more there's provability behind everything we're seeing in the videos with regards to the different basically data points that come out in other areas of your investigation that you can then correlate back to very seamlessly. If I could address a couple questions here from the chat, I'll just go through 2 or 3. There's a few that I really appreciate. Nature's Wisdom says, well, if chemicals can be altered to create exothermic reactions, I think you're looking for, my friend, instead of endothermic, is it possible to create clothing that could absorb heat perfectly? In theory and in principle, yes. Technically, yes. When you talk about atomic layer deposition and you talk about, optical lithography and nano fabrication and all of that, the sky's the limit ultimately. The only limitation at the end of the day comes down to finances and resources in order to practically manufacture these things, have a team of engineers to design and so on. But yes, yeah. Captain James West says Planck's constant is why we have wave particle duality in measurements. Yep. Let's see. Joe Velacci says we work off the same tech and it even unifies consciousness with physics. I would fully agree. Ray Tracer, this was the question that I wanted to get to, says, why does gravity somehow uniquely possess attractive repulsive properties and no other wave does? Well, this is where it gets interesting, because gravity itself, we could say, is an emerging force. Topologically, it is the birth child of when electricity and magnetism are brought together to meet very particular conditions. Now, we know in electricity that we have a positive and negative polarity electrically, whether that's running a current or a voltage and so on and so forth. And so the question becomes, is it possible to measure gravity electrically? And we know, for example, that it might be possible to measure gravitational phase shifts, for example, even at the astrophysical scale, using electrical devices. And we know this because one thing I will say is that Mr. Lupinov from the Soviet era wrote a paper in the Soviet Journal of Physics, which I'd happily provide Ashton with afterwards, talking about how electromagnetic capacitors could act as detectors of gravitational waves. And so if we consider the possibility, the same way that, I know this may sound silly, but from a philosophical sense, it may not, the way in which if we have divine masculine representing electric permittivity and the divine feminine representing magnetic permeability, if those conditions are brought together in the same way that male and female birth a child, but in the laboratory, if we were to have a scenario where E and M, the E and B fields, are vectored to 0 and various conditions are met in a way that it is not vectoring to the 0 that we normally think of in the standard school system, it's possible that that 0, that different 0, becomes something else that can be measured electrically but behaves gravitationally. And because it is an extension or fractal bifurcation of the initial electromagnetic induction, it's going to have a polarity to it. As above, so below, plus minus, the same way that an electrical capacitor has a plus and a minus to it. And the reason we have electricity coupled with gravity in particular is because people might say, Dave, why electromagnetism and gravity compared to other aspects of science and physics? Well, electromagnetism has that weak gravitational coupling to it, and that's been confirmed. The problem is just scaling it up, but yeah.
That's what I've noticed in the papers that I was re-reviewing them again today before our interview here, and I did notice that one of the things that comes up is, yes, we can find a lot of these effects. Like we can get negative energy in the lab. We can find this coupling that we know there's a relationship between gravity and electromagnetism. We just can't make it very powerful, at least in the publicly available papers. But then, that becomes then the engineering issue, is how do you find the ways to cheat the system to get your exponential growth or whatever you might need? Like when we look at the orbs, when they converge, Bob Greenyer talks about the amplification of energy. And I looked up Coulomb's law and found out, when the radius reduces, you get an exponential growth. So these are the kinds of things we're looking for. Even when I talked to Jack Sarfati, one more thing real quick. And then, because when I talked to Jack Sarfati, I asked him about superconductivity, and it seemed like there was kind of a similar relationship with superconductivity in the equations, where it allows for this I don't know if it's necessarily exponential, but this extremely powerful effect that will manipulate the equations in such a way where we can get some powerful, real macroscopic effects to occur. Go ahead.
100. I couldn't agree with you more. Let me see very quickly, but oh, there we go. That's what I wanted to mention. The other aspect of this is Euler's constant. If you look at the eccentricity of Euler's constant, which is the fine structure constant, you'll notice that there's no number in which repeats itself in that constant. And the question then becomes, if you can electrically couple to that constant, in which the gravitational coupling seems to permit, then you would be able to, with the right threshold, at the right RPM, assuming we're doing an electromechanical apparatus here, you would be able to essentially, permit and amplify as well as absorb and detect gravitational waves. So the notion being that if you had and this is also why it becomes equally as threatening on the next level of things, because the notion is that if you have a system in which there's a self-sustaining feedback from the ether, that would mean that anytime you have a situation where you can have an electromagnetic setup in the laboratory that can detect gravitational waves, it's also very possible that that electromagnetic setup can emit gravitational waves, therefore acting as a transducer. And that also becomes equally as threatening, because then if you can emit gravity waves, then you start messing with time, and you start messing with you could say the graviton lattice of the actual vacuum itself. And the vacuum has multiple layers to it, like an onion. But I just wanted to address something here that someone had said regarding gravity, because it gets interesting. Let me see very quickly. Someone had asked about.
Go ahead. I'll be right back to you. So you take the next 2 or 3 minutes to let them
Sure,
explain.
Sure. Edwin says, I'll just answer some of the comments here, which I appreciate, guys. Let's assume all data points to it is all real, US made tech, and so on. Now, was the plane transported into another parallel universe or world, or just into another location in our current reality? Without data, I can't say, Edwin, my friend, but I would venture to say that it was just another spatial location within this reality, assuming it wasn't an exothermic event, assuming it was a teleportation scenario. Can being on shrooms make me see orbs? That I don't. Everyone's different, to be honest. One thing I can tell you is that the patterns and geometry seen when someone takes mushrooms are starkly similar, if not identical, to the patterns that are seen in superconductor crystalline structures, if you were to look at it in a very, very micro scale. When superconductors are in their critical state, it gets really interesting, the correlations there. Let's see here. Ray says, why gravity waves are special compared to other waves? CH says, do we need gravitons for this? Isn't gravity just time dilation? Correct, yes. So in other words, when we talk about these longitudinal waves, quite often we could say that they're gravitational and graviton based. And this is where, again, this is why it's both a particle and a wave, because it has to be both, but neither simultaneously, with respects to the way in which the vacuum works within a vortex-like way. So if you have a vortex in which you want to, increase to a certain extent, you still need to have the potential surrounding that vortex always be there in case you ever wanted to increase that vortex even more. And so that potential is always surrounding that vortex in and of itself. And the reason I bring up the potential is because the magnetic vector potential is what allows for the gravitons to continue to ride that orthogonal metric, or orthonormal tetrad metric, which is, tetrad means pairs of fours, which is this quadrupole dipole nature that is constantly stretching and expanding through the space-time momentum, so to speak. So in simple terms, isn't gravity just time dilation? That's one effect of it. Yes, you could say that. Sorry, yes.
Because space and time are interrelated, right? So if we have this idea of this, gravity is the stress on the medium of space-time, then obviously there's going to be some stretching of time itself as well, right?
100%. Yes. So this is where it gets interesting, because it's a completely different way of looking at a lot of the stuff we already know, which is that if we think of the notion of acceleration being directly related to gravity, we think of this notion of rotating magnetic fields, for example. There comes a point in which it may be possible to have a rotating magnetic field with some photonic components to it, the same way, for example, that laser gyroscopes were looked into, but they were kind of scuttled away into silence because certain effects were being noticed there as well, which is that it may be possible in a rotating frame of reference to have an absolute frame of reference that could slow down the speed of light and therefore affect gravity in and of itself. And so when people talk about gravity, is gravity time, is gravity the bending, the metric itself, I don't want to say what it is so much as what it isn't, because at the end of the day, gravity in and of itself has so many various physical and philosophical meanings to it that it's not for me to tell everyone, no, everyone, you have to listen to what I'm saying about what it is, end all be all. Not necessarily. Does it affect time? Is it time? We can have those debates all day long. It gets philosophical.
Yeah, I think for another time, if we talk, I'd like to discuss time and time dilation and retrocausality with you. For today, I want to talk about the papers and the science around it. We're not going to really dig too much into the time travel aspect. And to switch gears real quick, first I want to thank the people in the super chats that put in there. Chadwell, thank you very much. Anon, big donation. Thank you very much. Appreciate you, man. Team Manted. Yeah, Team Manted all the way. Love you. I love the picture of me with the things, if you can see that in that one. And then Daniel, thank you very much, man. Appreciate you guys with those donations. So the concepts that are going to be, in my opinion, interlinked that we're going to talk about here right in a second, and if you want to briefly comment on them before we jump into the papers, you can, is faster than light communication, EM drive, which is, if you want to think of like Star Trek impulse drive, because when we talk about anti-gravity, we're really just talking about a repulsive force that cancels out gravitational force, allows something to hover freely. Then warp drive, which is really the thing that I think we're seeing in these videos, is some extra manipulation that goes beyond just levitating into a situation where you can actually just instantaneous transmission, so to speak. Maybe not necessarily instantaneous, but fast as the speed of light or faster. And then the ideas of low energy nuclear reactions, cold fusion, and then straight up free energy. My mind says that the only way all of these things can be possible, and they all become possible simultaneously, is the idea of an extra dimension of unlimited negative energy, known as the ether, which is something that Tesla was a proponent of, and Kaluza as well, which we'll dig into in one of these papers. Now, the implications of this, are, in my mind, are at least threefold, possibly more. One, people ask about the conservation of momentum. What happens to the plane in this situation? I think that the scientists like you and Bob Grenier would argue that we can violate the conservation of momentum and we can potentially set this plane down somewhere else in a remote location, and that it doesn't have to come out there. My opinion, just intuition looking at it, is that I think this plane is coming out at the same speed that it went in on the other side. In which case we won't have a violation of conservation of momentum, because we're warping in a space bubble in a wormhole. And from the perspective of the person on the inside frame of reference of the plane, it's just going to look like they're walking through a doorway. There's all of a sudden on the other side, plane goes through, plane continues out at the same speed. Thermodynamics, second law of thermodynamics, which pretty much says, if I'm understanding this correctly, that we can't produce over unity due to the way that hot flows to cold. You can never get something to be 100% perfectly efficient. That's where I think you would come in and say, well, you open up your system, open up Pac-Man's mouth to the ether, to the vacuum fluctuation.
If I could say very, very quickly, the conservation of momentum would be preserved in this case through what's called gauge invariance, and then the second law of thermodynamics would in fact be violated. And we know that the second law of thermodynamics, by the way, is literally violated constantly, because when as long as superconductors are staying in their critical state, they are violating the second law of thermodynamics. As long as you
perfectly efficient.
Yes, as long as you have, say, for example, liquid nitrogen or what have you, liquid helium or whatnot, inside of a bowl in which a superconductor is then levitating atop, say, a magnet within, the levitation will never stop so long as it stays in its critical state. So in principle, we have already violated that second law of thermodynamics. It's just never been really addressed.
Don't heat pumps do it as well? Is that true?
Common home heat pumps do. They have a COP, or coefficient of performance, of like 7 or 8, for example. The problem is that they've been, dare I say, diabolically designed, in the sense that the second it gets cold out there, you're back on resistance heating, because those common home heat pumps don't have an open system within them. In other words, Pac-Man's mouth is not opened. And so you're 100% correct. In other words, the people might say, what you're telling me, for example, that I don't have to plug into the wall, or the heat pump in my home can yes, ultimately yes. Now, this is what brings the situation back to what is called, and this is something I will say, first time I've said it. No, I brought it up before, but I brought it up lightly on the show with Paez. The source charge problem. That's what it's called. It's been suppressed for many decades. You try and Google it. I don't think you can find anything on it. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But the source charge problem essentially was a problem that electrodynamicists had many, many years ago, pre-World War II, World War I, and even after the fact, which was that they did not understand where energy was coming from ultimately. And what they ended up realizing essentially was that either one of two things occurred. And we know this because Li and Yang won the Nobel Prize in 1957 for the broken symmetry of opposite charges. They were able to prove that you can break the gauge symmetry of opposite charges and still stabilize it longitudinally. Now, what's interesting is that I believe it was Li that said we have this at the time in 1957 after they won the prize, and they were given the prize super quickly in a very abnormal manner, almost as if they discovered something super underneath the radar that even the official announcement did not disclose. But Wu had stated, and I'm paraphrasing, and I quote, "We have missed the opportunity to interact with a local vacuum," with regards to what can occur there. Now, the source charge problem essentially deals with the notion that we don't know ultimately where energy comes from. And we know that even Richard Feynman and John Wheeler touched upon this. But what we're noticing now is that either conservation of energy needs to be completely violated, which it is, in my opinion, it doesn't, because the ether itself is an open system, which implies directly that the virtual particle fluctuations from the magnetic vector potentials in the ether or the vacuum directly from the Planck scale give rise to the electrical charges that we know to be all around us, essentially. And so this is where it becomes a little bit abnormal in terms of a linear way of thinking. But it's this notion that, for example, there are fluctuations in the vacuum that don't exist but can exist if certain conditions are met, and will always be possible to be able to exist in what we call empty space, essentially.
Yeah,
yeah.
I was just gonna say, because I think that most conventional academic physicists would disagree with you there and say that it's definitely being violated, that the conservation of energy. Because that was the last one I was going to bring up, is that I think we absolutely have to rewrite the law of conservation of energy, and that's to incorporate. And I'm not disagreeing with anything you said. I absolutely agree with this idea that it's the interaction between the ether and our reality, and that these virtual particles that are coming in gives rise to the charge and energy that we experience within our reality all around us. But because it does offer an opportunity where you can use that as an open system to extract energy and produce energy locally that seems like it's coming from nowhere, then that, in my mind and most physicists' minds, I think would say, no, that you're violating the law of conservation of energy, that energy cannot be created nor destroyed, because we are, in theory, we're not creating it out of nothing. We're just borrowing it from the ether itself. So it depends on how you look at it, right?
100%. This goes right back to the John Wheeler and Richard Feynman one electron universe theory, which was that we live in one big fractal electron, so to speak. And so that the electrons we see orbiting, say, within a device, for example, are bifurcations or fractal ripples, basically, or branches of a larger tree or trunk of a larger electron. And that would permit this notion of an open system to also work too, because it would be self-sustaining in the sense that you have, for example, if you think of one slice of an onion taking energy from the next slice above it, and then that slice above it taking from the next one, and so on, which then gives direct credence to this notion of what Dr. James Giordano and his colleagues out of DARPA and the European Human Brain Project authored, which was with another colleague, I think Diana Dedulus out of Lockheed Martin, which was an oscillatory theory of consciousness. So not to get into that, but basically we're seeing these connections with this notion of oscillations and resonance constantly.
Okay, well, so that was good to kind of set the framework for what we're going to talk through here, because I think I'm going to try to go through some key points on these various three papers. We're not going to read through all of them, but a lot of the same concepts we just talked about are repeatedly discussed in these three DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency papers. Before we get to that, I just want to show people this document that was found last week. I mean, people have probably found it for a while. It's out there since 2001. but it's about subject scalar waves. This was from the CIA reading room here. This document essentially talks about Maxwell's equations and how scalar potentials are possible because of Maxwell's original equations before they were reduced by Oliver Heaviside. Some parts that I thought were really interesting is down here. It talks about this symposium, their conference that happened about Nikola Tesla, and Tom Bearden's name gets mentioned. But there's all this stuff blacked out here. I would kill to figure out what is being blacked out down here because seems like it's probably pretty important. I don't know if it's people's names or what have you.
It's not names.
But, oh, okay. Yeah, because then
No,
it'd be really interesting because this talks about like how this could be useful for the R&D community here. And I imagine that this is where like we're trying to get ahead of where the Soviets were with some of this.
Yep.
I'm guessing this document goes back to the 90s, maybe even to the 80s, and then it got declassified in 2001. But this is where it talks about exactly how what you said, you can cancel out the magnetic potential or the electric potential, and now you're not necessarily left with nothing. And there is a I think it's a beautiful analogy that Tom Montauk told me that I'm going to go ahead and share right now with this rubber band that I've got, which is that classical physics would say if I pull on this rubber band on both sides equally, that there's a net zero because the forces cancel each other out. If I pull a little bit harder, still net zero. Even though I'm pulling harder, still net zero. And I keep pulling, still they would say it's net zero. But if I pull this thing too hard, all of a sudden it's just going to snap. And why is it snapping? Because there's stress in the medium, which is the rubber band itself. Same way if we're like when we play musical instruments.
Can I just say very quickly, after the band snaps, it becomes something else.
Okay, you might have to expand upon that because here's my final point is that if we look at space-time the same way and we take these equations and we say, okay, if we cancel it out, there's nothing left. What are we left with? We're left with the stress in the medium. And what is the stress in the medium of space-time? Gravity manipulation. To me, this is how it makes perfect sense how Maxwell's equations shouldn't have been rewritten the way that they were, shouldn't have been reduced, because this is how we're able to do all the stuff we're doing right now. We're streaming, we're talking to each other right now over all the stuff, but the only thing we can't figure out is how to manipulate gravity. So yeah, to me, this is the missing link.
Sure. If I could say very quickly, I love the elastic band example, by the way. So if we take that same example and we stretch it to the point in which we eventually break its symmetry, so now it's become asymmetric. What if instead of actually the band breaking, what if when we expect it to break, it actually ends up becoming something else entirely, in which it becomes a self-sustaining rotating band? Basically. Now, this is what I mean by topology. This is what I meant about half an hour ago when I talked about under the right conditions, electromagnetism, when the vectors are summed to zero, give rise to a whole other phenomena that can be measured electromagnetically, but is an entirely new type of energy, in this case, gravitational, so to speak. Now, if I could quickly address here two comments that I really appreciate, which are JK Philly fan says, if I could get one question in on the magneto-optical trap idea, or is it just an artificial sheath with the orbs when you go back to the MH370 topic? Thanks, Ashton and Dave. Well, I'll let Ashton touch on that, but very quickly, I've said this to Ashton privately as well, too. I can only put together a generalized hypothesis of the functionality in terms of the engineering of the orbs itself. I did not engineer those orbs myself, so I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I know the intricacies of how they work. This notion of magneto-optical trap idea, I don't rule it out, but I can't say for certain in the case of that particular footage. I don't know, Ashton, if there's anything you wanted to jump in on.
That goes over my head. JK Philly fan knows more about the science than I do, even honestly.
Okay, got you.
Me, I'm just like a theoretical physicist, if an amateur one at that. So I try to understand the concepts, but even the hard math, like it's going to take me another year or so to really wrap my brain around it.
Got you. So the other one I wanted to say here was Dave by Connor McKibben 73. Dave, in the same way the double slit experiment simplicity is its fascination, is there a comparable experiment for electromagnetism that alludes to the magic you speak of? Yes. Give me a couple minutes to think on how I can word that electromagnetic experiment.
Okay.
I brought it up on an X space back in November, December with you. I'm considering bringing it up again, although it's a practical example it was logged, it was put in the literature, but it's hushed away. But yeah,
So yeah, keep that one on the back of your mind.
Yeah.
Because here's the other thing too. I forgot to mention this before when I was showing the videos, but when I look at this event happening here, the way I imagine it was talking about like breaking the Schwinger limit. When you look up the Schwinger limit, it talks about space-time getting non-linear. Is the way I look at this is like a literal rip through the fabric of reality. And we're going to look at it in these papers in a second that this wormhole, the big difference between the wormhole and a black hole is that there's no event horizon.
Right.
And that's extremely important to understand because it means that there is some type of relationship that's very similar of this black hole, is that you are ripping through the fabric of reality here, but you're not creating a gravitational force where if you were to fall into it, you're going to get ripped to shreds. And I think that's going to be very important when we talk about this. So what's happening is, why is it so fast? If you look at this in real time, it happens in like a fraction of a second, like a 10th or a 20th of a second. Is that there's like this self-correcting mechanism that occurs where, space-time fills in the gap right away. Like that's why we don't see the ether all around us, is that in order to sustain this, you have to achieve these really high energy levels and that we see with these orbs pulling off right here. There's very specific stuff we have to do. And so we see it and then immediately kind of think of like reality rushes in and closes the gap. And now all of a sudden it's not there anymore. At least that's how I imagine it.
100%. I'm totally with you. There's so many different areas in which one can go down with respects to the effects of these field forces and the different the different types of forces that they can produce, for example. So we're not just talking about gravitational forces. We can also talk about, for example, the notion of an electrogravitic force, which is, we can argue, a little bit different than a purely gravitational force, and so on and so forth. But yes, I'm totally with you. The one thing I did want to bring up in addition to that, to add to what you said and to what Connor McKibben asked, which is, so Connor, there are 4 or 5 off the top of my head that I know of in terms of electromagnetism that speaks to similarity in terms of its amazement regarding the double slit experiment. But one of them is, and this is something I can mention because it is in the published literature, albeit it's very seldom even known, to my knowledge at least. But there was a time when two gentlemen, Saxel and Woodward, they found when they took an aluminum cylinder and they put it on a scale, and they ensured that there was no noise or any significant artifacts that this could be attributed to. But they took an aluminum cylinder, put it on a scale, they attached that aluminum cylinder to a certain type of electric capacitor. When they charged the cylinder and then started rotating the cylinder started to lose its own weight.
Yeah.
So
that speaks to this idea that there's a relationship between over unity and anti-gravity. And this was talked about. If you guys watched the Y-Files episode about this, it was great. I mean, our buddies were mentioned in the Y-Files episode. Thomas Bearden gets a shout out. Salvatore Paez gets a shout out. I mean, that was one of the most surreal episodes I've ever watched, where he's showing the over unity device where the voiceover narration is Thomas Bearden. I'm going, whoa, this is just bizarre. I feel like one day there will be a Y-Files episode about the MH370 videos. Maybe they'll even clip this in there. So what I want to get into here, I'm going to pull this back up for just 1 second, is at the end of this document, it talks about the idea of the Maxwell equations, but then it also says if such scalar waves exist, then they will be transformed by a collective phenomenon from microscopic waves to macroscopic waves. And then it says, it mentions Cooper pair electron effects as well, which I thought was interesting because that brings up the idea of superconductivity having some relationship. I don't know exactly, it doesn't really go into depth there, but then it says they will also behave like longitudinal waves in a plasma and grow via propagation on a non-optical branch of the WK space. I don't know exactly what that means. But I just thought that seemed like to be right on the nose, because when we talk about longitudinal waves versus transverse waves, supposedly I think all waves in the ether supposedly are longitudinal. I'm not sure about that. I think that's what Thomas Bearden said.
The So this speaks to the notion of entropy and negentropy. So what we consider transverse waves, we could argue, are the outfolding effects of the longitudinal waves, so to speak. And so that is why, again, we talk about this notion of Bohmian, after David Bohm, coherence and decoherence, this notion of infolding and outfolding, which speaks to a morphogenic fractal holographic reality that we may very well be living within. Now, what's interesting about this is that you brought up Cooper pairs. And one thing that I'll leave a hint to you and your audience for, which is that the BCS theory, Bearden, Cooper, Schaefer theory, which is there were three different gentlemen that won the Nobel Prize because they basically gave a general model of understanding superconductors, superconductivity, and so on and so forth. Coincidentally, there's one component they missed in terms of what the Cooper pairs or where the Cooper pairs actually stem from that doesn't necessarily seem to be addressed within their theory. And I know this because I've looked into their literature very extensively, and at least to my best knowledge and best efforts, I couldn't find anything that addresses this. And what that missing component essentially has to do with are we could say certain elements that are geometric in the composition of the superconductors that are not really mentioned. I think I know that geometry in physics is not really looked at as something super prominent in the engineering world, although for certain projects they certainly are, don't get me wrong. But I would say that we need to emphasize geometric alignment and positioning much more strongly than we currently are if we're looking to induce these type of effects. It may be possible that you can do certain things with superconductors in a certain geometrical arrangement that would induce a phenomena or observable macroscopic effects that otherwise would not be able to be induced if those superconductors were, say, not geometrically positioned in a certain formation, for example. We see, for example, as well, whether it's Sal Paez's patents or whether it is other individuals in the past with their patents as well, we see this reoccurrence of the squaring the circle. I know, not who was it? Graham Hancock had talked about, I think, the Mayans being into that a long time ago, squaring the circle, a triangle, this notion of quite often we'll find in a lot of these patents geometric shapes very similar to that of occult groups. And so I certainly think there's something there. And that also unifies both physics with metaphysics, if you will. So that's my personal take on that. So.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. And Jake, thank you very much. Huge donation. Wow, wants to know more about the ether. Just keep watching. We're definitely going to talk more about it. What I will say, we're going to go into the paper here right now, is that I think the ether solves a lot of the problems that we have related to physics out there, especially with respect to anti-gravity capabilities. But what you're going to see is there is a direct relationship between this idea of the ether and extra dimension and dark energy, which is also, I think, effectively equivalent to negative energy. And so we're going to talk about that. That's actually definitely getting brought up in these papers. So actually, it'll be coming up here in the next 5 or 10 minutes. So thank you very much, Jake. And let's get this bad boy going. So the first paper, Anti-Gravity for Aerospace Applications. And when you dig through this, right in some of the contents here, we're not going to go through all of these, but anti-gravity via gravitomagnetic forces negating Newtonian gravity, kind of goes through what the definitions are for us out there, and I've already explained some of those. The vacuum energy of Einstein's cosmological constant, dark energy, anti-gravity propulsion applications for dark and vacuum energy. Talks about 0-point fluctuations, so anti-gravity via quantum 0-point fluctuations force. I think, that's one of the ones we're going to talk about here. And what you'll find, too, is the Casimir effect comes up in all of these papers every single time, which the Casimir effect, from what I've seen, is potentially a way of proving that there is a negative energy density that's out there that in the 0-point fluctuations that we don't perceive. Any quick comments before we get to our first thing?
Sure, 100%. I mean, with regards to this paper, in relation to some of the comments that I'm seeing in terms of people asking about, double slit experiment, all of that, we have to continually look at this notion of interference, as even Mr. Bearden talked about, this notion of interferometry, or the overlapping of various energies, whether that is photons or electricity or so on and so forth.
Yeah.
being able to produce some certain effects that we see discussed even here, right? Anti-gravity via gravitomagnetic forces.
Yeah, and the one thing actually is probably not going to get brought up here, so I'll say it, is that I think the double slit experiment is also explained by the ether, because the speed of light is only constant because we see it in the medium that we're living in all the time, which is our reality. But if you rip away this reality and you go to that, when we looked at that dark hole in the MH370 video, what is the speed of light through the ether? What if it's infinite? If
Right.
it's infinite, now every point in space and time is connected from a causal perspective. And if that's true, now you can begin to understand how you could have non-local effects, which are quantum entanglement, quantum tunneling, quantum teleportation. And then when you look at it from that perspective, time is no longer linear. Time is now a flat circle, as they would say in the True Detective TV show. And to your point, I think that you would agree that, you think of time more as a circle that, each event doesn't necessarily come one before the other. And we're not going to take too much of the time aspect, but I think that that's where you can now understand how you can have particle wave duality and how there might be an answer to that and how it acts differently.
100%, particularly when you look at the notion of rotating reference frames and this notion of frame dragging via gravitomagnetic forces, the same way that, for example, you were to drag an image on a computer and you see sort of on older computers, if you were to drag your mouse across, you would see that lag. It's very possible that may be a very similar effect that would be seen in the laboratory when these effects are induced.
And you hear that and you think lag. Isn't that like when I'm playing Call of Duty and I'm playing or playing StarCraft against the Korean kids and I've got the lag? Well, it kind of is. It kind of is, because the lag is based on the speed of light. So, you could imagine, this is why I think absolutely we live in a holographic universe, that is, we are living in some kind of matrix that our reality is painted on, because that's why we have a lag effect. That's why we experience this lens thirring effect, which is exactly what I was going to ask you first here. That was the very first thing I wanted to bring up, which is how you explain the lens thirring effect, because the way I understood it when I read this here as well is this idea that you are just kind of pulling space around you potentially, and then that's how you can kind of the basis for some of these effects, these gravitational effects. What is your thought on how would you explain the lens thirring effect to our
well, this is where it gets interesting, because the lens thirring effect directly implies, for example, that when you have this type of observation occur both microscopically, but even macroscopically, it implies that there's some type of medium in which that frame dragging occurred within, right? And so, which directly speaks to this notion of space and time, or the metric of space time itself being that of some type of simulation or holographic principle that is ultimately comprised of information matrices or matrices, for example. And so when we look at these different type of information matrix structures that naturally may be orthogonal in nature, it wouldn't be all that out there or far-fetched to be able to, again, as His Highness says here, create a shift in space-time in which we see this frame dragging effect occur the same way that, for example, people would see, when people claim to see craft shoot off, they see almost the sort of lag behind it in a certain aspect, right? The lens thirring effect is without a shadow of a doubt very, very significant and very important to understanding the nonlinear aspect of both taking all four polarizations of a photon in correspondence with curving space and time electrically.
Yeah, because imagine you were looking at something that's manipulating space-time. It's going to look super weird.
With the magnetic vortex
kind of
as well.
bending. And we can even tell, like, imagine just gravitational lensing. When we look at a star behind a black hole, and you see it bend on all four sides of it. So we know that there's going to be some bizarre lensing effect. And actually, we're going to talk in a later paper a little bit more about the lensing effect. Sure. But I want to go to the next thing here right away, which is toroids. Toroids at the center of all of this. And so this paper here specifically mentions, I think the part that I thought was interesting was how you could, what was it? Add the current. Oh, I didn't take a lot of notes on here actually on this one.
No problem.
But I think the big issue here was that we can show that we can potentially manipulate gravity, but on small scales here, where you can see this G, I believe, going up. Correct me if I'm wrong on this. But that the difficulty here is how you scale it up, like you were saying before. But really, for me, I think the point here is that the toroid is really this shape that comes up all the time when it comes to plasma physics or when it comes to anti-gravity type effects. It constantly shows up. Do you have any comments about the toroid in general while I look through and see if I can find the comment?
Well, I can certainly say 1 second here. If I saw someone had mentioned, His Highness had mentioned gravity is curvature, I would say that the curvature induces and couples to gravity much more effectively, and I agree. Now, that is what Mr. Forward is proposing here. This notion that, again, various toroidal geometries inherently enable curvature because of their curvilinear, what was it? Azimuthal angles. I think that's how you pronounce it. But anyways, point being is that Mr. Forward essentially proposed here, and I'm paraphrasing, that I think they had said they would need a toroid the size of like a football stadium or something like that in order to induce the effects. Now,
yeah, here it is right here, actually, right there. Yeah. It says, so, yes, this is the part I wanted to actually go show that there would need to be an accelerated matter with the density of a dwarf star through pipes as wide as a football field wound around the torus with a kilometer dimensions in order to produce an anti-gravity field of G equals 10 to the 10.
10. Yeah.
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 So to produce a very strong one, you need, like, seems like it would be very difficult, but I have a feeling there's going to be ways to cheat that.
Yes, and this is where it gets very interesting, because this is what I mean when I say that. Again, this is where the papers were towing a certain line, and I think that it's also possible that these papers were published with the intent to see who may as well be interested in this type of aspect of physics and science, and to sort of get an understanding from various perspectives of other agencies as to who's interested in what and so on. But the point being here from the science angle is that when you look at this toroidal nature of things, we see, again, whether it's Bob Greenier's fractal toroidal moment, or we see, for example, all of Paez's patents having to do with this notion of, square root electric permittivity that then speaks to we could say, again, the squaring of a circular motion or counter rotating cones and so on and so forth. It may be possible that there's a shortcut without a shadow of a doubt. Instead of, it was still using the toroidal geometries. That's not to dismiss anything of what this paper is discussing conceptually, but from an engineering perspective, I don't think we would need something the size of a football field.
Yeah, and this is the part right here where it starts talking about spinning as well, which is the lens theory effect as well. Like when the planet spins, Earth spins, there's a lens theory effect that we've been able to measure. Now, you imagine if you speed that spinning up and you increase that lens theory effect, you are kind of warping gravity, your space-time around the object. Now, the reason why I thought this was really interesting is if I change my presentation for just a second to my other video here, that's what's going on in the MH370 videos, especially when you get to the part here where they reorient around the plane. Because now they're spinning. So remember that comment we read on Reddit where it says, perhaps when they're spinning like this is actually a specific reason for that. And Bob Greenier brings this up and he says they are their own toroid, each orb is, and they're creating a larger tor -1 above them at a higher level, which is they're creating a torus around the plane itself. I thought that there was a relationship here to this paper because in this next part in the paper, it's specifically, and this is the part about the catapult that I wanted to mention, which is one can view this genre of devices as a gravity catapult machine, which with the machine pushes a body away using its general relativistic anti-gravity forces to impart a change in velocity. A space launcher operator on the ground wanting to send a payload into orbit would just ratchet up the strength of the upward directed anti-gravity field to some value above minus or G or 1 minus G, and after pressing the release button on the payload, accelerate up and away into orbit. These devices could be placed on Earth orbit. So basically what they're saying here is that you set this toroid up and then you just, boom, shoot something in outer space. As long as the force is greater than gravity, it's just going to accelerate upward. And I look at this and I go, well, this one isn't accelerating upward, it's accelerating backwards, consistent with the right-hand rule. And so I don't know, any thoughts on that? Because I went, whoa, there's my Yahtzee moment right there.
I would certainly say that I would encourage you to pursue that angle. That's the most I could probably say. There comes a point where just sometimes, it's like, oh, it's so
so I want us to say whatever we can say, but I don't want anybody to get any knocks on the door. Well, except for me, I'm trying to get a knock on the door, but I don't want you to get any knocks on the door because we need to keep you protected. So the next one here is the negative energy densities of the ether. So going back to what Jake was asking about the ether and what even is negative energy. and I'm probably going to have ask you to kind of describe it. But from what I read through here, it's essentially the pressure that we have out there, and that when we write our equations, we think of it in terms of repulsion and attraction. And so when we think of like positive and negative, we're not thinking of like something that is the opposite of something else, but it is kind of like that from a force perspective. So that it's producing a contrary force to what we would expect to be a normal, everyday energetic reaction.
They essentially have opposing directional or unilateral forces. Yes, essentially. So they exhibit the same characteristics as the particles we understand to be all around us right now and observable and interactable, but except simply with the opposite direction, so to speak, in that aspect.
And the thing I like about it is that there's always symmetry in the universe. And so it's like, well, what's the symmetry of our reality? Our reality itself seems like it's something that doesn't have an opposite. But what if the opposite is like that we are the painting on the canvas and the canvas is the ether underneath it? And if we rip through it, now we have the exact opposite of what.
And now you're going through the exact same line of thought that was gone through post World War II. Yes. That was the same notion that, again, what if the answer was more geometric than numerical? Right. Yeah. That was the other aspect of this as well. Yep.
And then in the next page here, so we talk about that there's negative energy has been found in nature all over. One of the examples, it talks about squeezed vacuum states, static radial dependent electric or magnetic fields. The Casimir effect gets mentioned here as well. So for people that don't know the Casimir effect, we take two plates and we put them close to one another. They will compress together. They create a force between them. And the idea here is that the wavelengths, certain wavelengths can't get between those plates anymore. And that this creates a negative pressure zone where they come together, negative energy. And so we know that it exists, that it's out there. And we know that it's happening on the quantum scale. Go ahead.
Right. And we also know, by the way, with the Casimir effect, we know that it is actually possible to induce an Alcubierre warp drive with positive energy but negative pressure. So we don't necessarily always need to have negative energy occurring all the time. Now, with that said, it has its benefits. But in the case of Alcubierre warp drive, there is a way to also induce a scenario where it's purely negative pressure with positive energy. And so if you can induce some of that negative pressure in a way that could enable a gradient within, the vacuum or the ether, then you would have a thrust, a unilateral thrust, just like a surfer would on riding a wave.
That's interesting. And then this idea of the cosmological inflation comes up. And this is where dark energy came from, which is the Big Bang. We know the universe expanded faster than the speed of light. Right. How is that possible? And this is where we've entered this idea of dark energy, and we think it's constantly expanding. So we think that the dark energy is what's causing the universe to expand. Well, what if the dark energy is just a relationship between the ether and our reality? And if you look at it from that perspective, from an extra dimensional perspective, now you can solve the problem of dark energy entirely. And then this now opens up to the door to exactly what we're talking about with these very powerful anti-gravitic effects and potentially warping space-time itself using the dark energy, which is really just the medium of the ether, and like what I think we see in the MH370 videos.
I couldn't agree with you more, brother. What you're doing is essentially you're bringing back, you're bringing back, essentially, I would argue that we are fish living within a vast ocean, but we're still debating as to whether or not the ocean could be used as a form of power and harnessing that power and so on and so forth. You're helping to bring back that the realization of the ocean that was always there, and so I thank you for that, and I couldn't agree more with you.
That's a great analogy, because I do think it's a matter of you're a fish in a fishbowl and you don't realize you're in a fishbowl. You think the fishbowl is all there is, but if the moment you look outside the fishbowl and look into it, you go, oh, there's this whole other thing that we don't even realize is there. And that's where, you imagine if there's no such thing as nothing, and kind of concepts like that become prominent.
Right.
Now, as well in here, the next one was... I was just going to say, I think I already mentioned this, but we know negative energy exists because of the Casimir effect. Somewhere in here as well, it mentions that we've actually been able to produce negative energy in labs as well. So we know it's possible, and it just comes down to a situation of how we scale it up to a point where we can get some of the effects that we need for something like a wormhole.
Right. Yep.
Now,
I mean, If I could say, a lot of these DIA papers, the theory and the physics is not disinformation, in my opinion, misinformation. There may be a few things here or there that are just trying to cover for something else that's not even mentioned in the paper, but the theory is not wrong in any of these papers. I think what's missing is largely the engineering perspective one has to take to then apply this theory into something that could actually work, because you may find quite a handful of physicists that may not necessarily disagree with a lot of the concepts brought into these papers, but the practical engineering aspect is where a lot of them start to become very doubtful. And so I think that's something we need to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, and engineering stuff isn't easy either. So
Right,
I think that
right.
just the theories can be accurate, but in the matter of trying to figure out how you engineer it gets to be somewhat difficult. So then here again is more stuff about the cosmological constant, as I described, how pressure could be a source of gravity as well. And then the vacuum energy of Einstein's cosmological constant. So a lot of this is bringing in what Einstein had worked on and looking at it through this other lens of how can we manipulate the Einstein equations to get these anti-gravity effects, as well as, like, you know, what do we have to adjust anything? Like, where are the inconsistencies that might be out there? In
Yes.
page 15 here, it also talks about the stress on the medium as well.
Right.
And the stress between, you know, what we are talking about as the ether here. It actually even mentions it right here. It says, the cure for this apparent energy conservation problem is the vacuum equation state given by equation 17, which is right up here. And then it says, a negative pressure is something like a tension in a rubber band. There you go.
There we
There we
go.
go. The rubber band analogy that we have. It takes work to expand the volume rather than work to compress it. The proof of this is as follows. The energy created in the vacuum by increasing expanding space by a volume element, which must be supplied by the work done by the vacuum pressure during the expansion of space. Therefore, Pvac equals minus Pvac. In other words, the work done by the vacuum pressure maintains the constant vacuum energy density as the space expands. Therefore, the vacuum acts as a reservoir of unlimited energy that provides as much energy as needed to inflate any region of space to any given size at the constant energy density. When I read that, I just think that's the ether. You're just explaining the ether with extra steps here. Like, this is, you know, and it explains what we see in the videos too, where it's like there's this relationship between the ether and our reality that's constantly pulling and pushing to get to this equilibrium state. And if you break it out of the equilibrium state, it's going to try to close back up and go back to the equilibrium state like immediately. And
but if you can engineer something in which you stabilize that disequilibrium, you may start to see some very interesting effects.
Yeah, like maybe we can make a Stargate.
It's possible. We have to wonder what happens when negative energy is macroscopically scaled up, and some of that symmetry of the vacuum is destabilized. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, and then it talks about dark energy here as well, which I think we can pretty adequately explain with the idea of the ether and the negative energy that we see out there. There seems to be a direct relationship between those two. And then pages 19 and 20 talk about anti-gravity via quantum vacuum 0-point fluctuation force. And this talks about the Casimir effect here as well. It mentions it by name right here in this paper. So we kind of touched upon this already, but this idea that, and this goes back to like stuff like the EM drive, for example, that I think Charles Bueller got a lot of attention on social media last week about, which is this idea that we can actually get propulsion without propellant, utilizing this type of effect. And this to me, in my mind, would be your basic Star Trek impulse drive. Like, if we just want to go slow speeds, like relatively speaking, then we would use some type of effect like this. But then we take this same effect and we scale it up. We get to that second order effect where now we can create a literal warp bubble and just, you know, warp ourselves on this location to the other. Go ahead.
100%. If I could say, with regards to Mr. Bueller, I have nothing but respect for him and his team and the work they're doing, particularly that he was, you know, very well versed for many decades in electrostatics. That what they're working on there, and if I could help clarify momentarily, is something that I would call electrogravitic, and I'll explain why I call it that. So they seem to be inducing a very similar effect to that of the Byfield Brown effect, you know, Thomas Townsend Brown. Now, a lot of people, to play devil's advocate, a lot of people will say, well, that's been disproven, or it's not practically feasible because in order for it to be something that could carry people, because what we're dealing with there is ion wind, and we're not dealing with a direct connection between electrons and gravity and that sort of aspect, and electricity being able to displace a mass, so to speak. Now, when I believe it was the Navy that provided Mr. Brown with a large vacuum chamber, in which the results of those tests were never declassified. However, there was a video of Mr. Brown and his colleagues drinking champagne and celebrating, indicating there was some successful result. Mr. Brown had written some handwritten notes and letters to colleagues before he passed that, yes, it does work in a vacuum chamber. Now, this is where it gets interesting again. I've conversed with many individuals who tried to replicate that same effect privately in a vacuum chamber in very controlled private laboratories, DoD affiliated, admittedly. And they said largely what happens is, as expected, when you try and do this ion thruster in a vacuum chamber, obviously there's no thrust because in a vacuum there are no ions. But this is what this individual told me. They said, with specific geometrical arrangements, we were able to get the effect to work in a vacuum chamber. And so that makes you think, again, if you're able to have some type of geometrical structure that conforms to the ether, then it's possible. Then that vacuum chamber that's placed over the whole experiment doesn't mean anything.
Interesting.
And so this was the attempt, in my humble opinion, many years ago, to conflate and dismiss Mr. Brown's work with simply ion wind. Now, there is a difference between the two, to be clear, but yeah.
And this paper here actually even mentions this idea that Caloni proposed an experimental device that could significantly magnify the repulsive force up to a measurable scale. Their proposed device is a multi-layered series of rigid Casimir cavities, with each cavity consisting of two thin metallic discs that are separated by a dielectric material, which is inserted to maintain rigidity. They suggest silicon oxide for the dielectric material because it is an efficient dielectric with low absorption over a wide range of frequencies and is inexpensive material that is easy to fabricate into layers. So right away already, and it's not necessarily giving us the exact answer, but it is proposing this idea that we can scale up these effects to achieve something that would be measurable. And that's the part too where I see stuff like this, and I again start to think about superconductivity and the idea of how we can like try to cheat the equations to get effects that are going to scale up to a point where they're going to not just become measurable, but like actually lift a person off the ground and things like that.
Absolutely, without a doubt. Yep.
Now the last part on this paper, skipping ahead a little bit, there's some more stuff on here as well. We're not going to talk about the non-retarded quantum interatomic because I don't want to get canceled. Just kidding. But no, there's some other different ways that it can be done here. But the Casimir effect one is the one I wanted to focus on the most because you see that come up time and time again on all three of these papers, which seems to be the kind of consistent theme. Now, in the conclusions here as well, it goes through a lot of the conclusions of anti-gravity via negative energy, and you'll see there's a lot of stuff on here. Again, Casimir effect gets mentioned again as well. But I also noticed this part about quantum coherent effects. And this part stuck out to me because a lot of what we've been talking about, a lot of Salvatore Pais' papers, superconductivity, everything seems to come down to these quantum coherent type effects, the idea of Bose-Einstein condensates, fermions changing to bosons, spin going from half integer spins to full integer spins. So I just thought this was interesting. It says other types of quantum coherence effects not already identified or invented should be theoretically developed and explored for the possibility of finding new free field or interacting field configurations that produce significant magnitude of negative energy, which could be produced by a technological means. So I see that. And right away, I'm thinking, how about some plasma orbs that can converge and break down the nonlinear, or break down the linearity of space-time itself?
Right.
And it blows me away because I had never read these papers before. I'm sitting out there back in October going, we need quantum computers, superconductivity, and we need to understand how warp drives work. And it's like, whoa, these papers were out there the whole time. So definitely gets a little bit spooky when you predict something and then people are talking about it right there in front of you.
100%, 100%. If I could say very quickly
Sure.
before we end up wrapping this up, because yes, as to your point, there are a handful of different ways that have been proposed in order to induce anti-gravity or vacuum polarization effects, dealing precisely with the notion of, for example, different isotopic ratio separation. For example, you talk about again, we talk about things like the Casimir effect. We talk about things like lasers, femtosecond pulse lasers being shot through a plasma, and then out on the other through a toroidal coil. If we talk about the Gertzenstein effect, running a photon through a very strong static B field and having a graviton come out on the other end. So there's certainly more than one way to skin this cat, without a shadow of a doubt. The other thing, if I could say quickly, that I wanted to address with regards to the comments here is that I noticed a lot of you have questions and things like that, and I want to thank Ashton for bringing my Twitter up at PodcastZ, or my X profile. I also do, for a handful of private individuals that are not DoD related, in-person and remote consulting on phasehelix.com. I noticed a lot of people have that, a lot of questions. So unfortunately, I couldn't get to all your questions, but this side up says, Dave, so everything is infolded into the ether. We become aware of things only when they're outfolded from the ether. Well, my friend, it depends on what level or layer we're speaking on, because if we're talking more of a metaphysical aspect, then you can argue that you are the source of what the ether expresses to a large extent. If we're talking about more of an engineering aspect of things, we only become aware of things when they're out. Forgive me, it's hard for me to answer that question without knowing what level or quote unquote layer of this conversation you're speaking to. It depends. You're talking below the Planck scale, so we're talking philosophy at that point, or are we talking more physicality? So I will have to unfortunately leave that one there. But
so actually, there's a little bit more. So if you
sure.
want to take note of those questions, because there's two more papers on now. They're not going to have as many points as I had for the first one, and we've already talked about a lot of the same concepts. But I do want to go through these other ones real quick as well, which on warp drive, dark energy, and manipulation of extra dimensions. Now, we've already, if you've been listening for the last hour and 45 minutes, we've addressed a lot of these concepts. But the key aspects I want to get to here's Alcubierre warp drive. So right away, you find out that what we're talking about here is Alcubierre warp drive. Here's the visual that you see that perfectly matches what you would see if you look up Alcubierre warp drive. So what we're talking about here is expanding and contracting space, either in front and behind your object, and creating warp bubbles. If you guys look up, was it Harold Sonny White, the NASA scientist? He experimentally showed some warping effects on straight lines that were out there. I watched a couple of these science physics influencers try to discuss his work, but to me, it seems pretty robust that he shows that we can create a real warp bubble out there.
Particularly when it's based off of Einstein's metric tensors. When you base it off of Einstein's work, it becomes difficult to refute. Yeah.
And then the next part is, so how do we make this to be possible? And here again, it talks about the cosmoelectric constant. And all this is based on Einstein's work that's out there. And then it'll talk here as well about in order for us, we need negative energy to make this happen. So how do we get negative energy? It talks about the Casimir effect here again. Here's a good example of the plates. And then it talks about Kaluza-Klein. So we need this extra spatial dimension, this idea of the ether. We're bringing back the ether because it's a cool ass name. And, I don't care if people think it's metaphysical, too bad, because it's an awesome name. And so that's what we're going to use.
The Robertson-Friedman-Walker time evolution metric also has a very similar model to the Kaluza-Klein one. So there have been propositions for this. It's just, again, you don't really see them discussed much.
Yeah, and if you just read it, it essentially says, inspired by unification, physicists from the earliest 20th century wanted to unify gravity and electromagnetism. The first attempt was by Nordstrom in 1914, who used a scalar potential for the gravitational field. That's what the stress in the medium, guys. Scalar potential.
We can go back 10 to 11 years prior to that, and we had 1903 E.T. Whittaker proposing the longitudinal aspect of the ether, which is, again, is what this seems to build on.
Yeah, so we're going back over 100 years. Then in 1919, 105 years ago, Kaluza offered a unique approach to unifying gravity and electromagnetism, which involved adding an additional spatial dimension to general relativity and populating this extra dimension with two mathematical objects called vector potential and scalar potential.
Can I just say
Does that
very
sound
quickly,
familiar?
this is
Go ahead.
there's no textbook, at least in North America, that ever calculates the magnitude of a potential. At best, they talk about potential intensity. If you can have a scenario where you look at the Poynting vector and the magnitude of that potential extending past that vector, you have a scenario in which you can extend the orthonormal tetrads within that. You have your left hand to your right hand rule basically occurring within the quadrupolar nature of the vacuum itself. So in other words, even this model in and of itself is linking back to every other major model that has discussed this, like Bondi's model, Pudov's model, and Paez's model, and so on.
Yeah, and then there was an issue with Kaluza that I think it didn't come out from observation. So then Klein came in and solved the problem from looking at it, I think, geometrically, if I remember correctly. And so that's why it's called the Kaluza-Klein, is that's how they kind of fixed the issue to make it now consistent again with Einsteinian physics.
Right. Yep.
And then page 16 here. So we're going to scroll down through some of this stuff, because then it talks about here too, the idea of dark energy as a higher dimensional artifact.
Right.
Now, what is it saying right there? It's talking about, like, just think of dark energy as the ether full of negative energy. I mean, that in my mind, that's how I perceive this. Is don't just think of dark energy as this thing that's pulling stuff around. Think of it as an extra dimension that's filled with unlimited negative energy, which is exactly what we need for these effects to occur. And this is where I would push back on Sabrine Hassenfelder, who's a prominent physicist out there, where she says, she kind of condescendingly replied to me saying, "Oh, you can't just add an extra dimension." And I just laughed because no, the physicists literally did just add an extra dimension. That's what we did. And physicists make up terms all the time.
If the Aronoff-Bohm effect shows that there's a feasibility to adding an extra dimension, that magnetic vector potential could be treated as an extra dimensional form of I mean, look at brain theory, BRANE, the Chung-Fries model as well. I mean, it's yeah.
Yeah, so it's not like this some fringe thing adding this extra dimension. I mean, it's been out there for a long time.
Right.
And then on page 16 here, it talks about let me see. Oh yeah, this, because then here it starts talking about warp drive and higher dimensional manipulation, which now, even just looking at the image, looks like what we're looking at in the MH370 videos, of this idea of ripping open through the fabric of space-time out there. And it says here, if one were to locally adjust the higher dimensional radius, then the dark energy density would also change locally. More specifically, if one were to adjust the radius of the extra dimension in the direct vicinity of a spacecraft, then the dark energy density would also change only in the vicinity of the spacecraft, as would the expansion of space. And when I think about that phrase, I'm thinking, okay, expand it right around your object. This is why we're mapping our plane. And then we're going to expand space around it, and then poof, that plane is going to move somewhere else, seemingly faster than the speed of light from the outside observer's perspective. And even here, when you look at this graph, now this picture here is black and white, so it's hard to see, but there's a ring around the spacecraft here, which you'll often see if you look up spacecraft and warp drive, this ring around them, which I think is intentional to show. And then just imagine, instead of a ring around our craft, we don't even need it to be connected to the craft. We just have orbs that float around the craft to produce that exact same gravity effect that we need.
Right. Exactly.
Now, page 19 here, and then it talks about the geometry of extra dimensions, which you're better at understanding this than I am, with the orthogonal, which I barely understand the orthogonal thing, which when I think of orthogonal, I think of like a literal matrix. Like if you imagine the Matrix movie, and then you have the four like cubes on top of cubes, and then each point connecting them would be your orthogonal 4 points.
That's
so for people who think that we're just making up fancy terms or what have you, no, there is some functional thing. Imagine a literal matrix in front of you and like a cube, like those are
another example would be also in Interstellar, the scene where Matthew McConaughey is going through time and not space to then contact his daughter. That, in my humble opinion, is a very eloquent visual of both the longitudinal waves and the orthogonality of the matrix, or of the vacuum, or the ether.
And then here on page 19, the key to creating warp drive is to create a false vacuum minimum, i.e. to modify the vacuum spectrum and inject some field which creates a de-Sitter minimum at the rear of the craft and an anti-de-Sitter minimum at the front of the craft. What this requires is a technology that would allow us to artificially manipulate the field content,
which would be
illustrated in Figure 7 here. So
Casimir could be one approach, right?
interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah, and the de-sitter stuff I have to look up again as well, but I understand the idea of contracting and expanding space like the
right.
Alcubierre drive going forward.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah, and honestly, I'm impressing myself with how much I'm able to keep up with some of this because it's
No,
a
you're
lot.
getting
But
it.
what I'd say to people out there is like anyone can figure this out. Is once you start to understand the major concepts and start to Google it, what have you. I have a lot of people ask me like, how do I begin to understand this physics and this science?
Right.
Start with the basics. You just like I started with just like how an electrical circuit works, and read out as many of the scientific concepts as you can, and then start to dig into some of these papers, and then the concepts will start to make sense to you. And then it's all about repetition. It's like just keep looking back at
because
them,
it makes you think if there was a possibility that some of our ancestors and their respective civilizations were able to understand this, they didn't go through thousands of hours of Bessel functions and trying to understand these things, but allegedly some of these civilizations, the entire population, maybe they weren't intricate in understanding the full details, but they generally understood how a unified understanding of the world, so to speak. And so if they were able to understand it at the time, perhaps through a form of geometry more than numerically, or a bit of both, I'm certain that we can. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is the part where you realize we've blinded ourselves. It's like we blinded one of our eyes with the Maxwell's equations, where you could imagine that because science is the measure of observable reality, scientific papers don't determine what's real. Observable reality does. Is that you could imagine that from an intuition perspective, the other civilizations could have figured out the anti-gravity aspects of it. They might not have had iPhones, but they can still understand the relationship because they can, find and see those properties, even using sound potentially. Now, page 21 here starts to talk about what the energy requirements would be for pulling this off. And they go, it's really, really high. And this is where Jack Sarfati's clip that I posted on Twitter, where he mentions this idea of, well, we can reduce C. And if we reduce C, now the mass energy requirement goes way down. And then Sebastian, who was also on that call with Alien Scientist and Jeremy, says, well, I think we can do that with plasmoids. And I went, whoa, we're looking at plasmoids in my videos here. Well, not mine, but the MH370 videos. And I'm going, well, maybe we can reduce the energy requirement. Another way this paper talks about is the bubble that you make around your craft. Just make it really thin. Because the thicker it is, the more energy requirement, but the thinner it is, like a soap bubble, like something very tiny, because we don't need it to be very thick. We just need it to be enough to warp spacetime. We're getting the same effect regardless of if the bubble is, hypothetically like an inch thick versus a millimeter thick, or a very small scale of thinness to it. So those are one ways where we can reduce it. And then if you look at Salvatore Pais' work, he mentions the idea of amplifying energy, which I think we see when we look at that Coulomb's law, where you see the orbs converging. So maybe all of them are correct.
We also have to recall, and unfortunately, sorry, in the next few minutes, brother, I do have to jet, but we also must recall when Sal Paez said on Kurt Mungel's show in his very first public appearance in any capacity, where he said essentially, it is not possible. The truth of the matter is, it is not possible to achieve these energy densities with solids, but it may be possible with plasmas.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so then I'll go kind of quick here, because so then one thing it mentions here as well is the idea that the Large Hadron Collider might be able to detect these extra dimensions, which I think is odd because it's been running for a while and this hasn't come up. So I don't know if it's being hamstrung. On page 23, it mentions the idea that we could use petawatt lasers here in labs around the country, which I imagine only these private labs from third-party defense contractors would have access to these.
You would need something like the Department of Energy's Z-pinch machine.
Yeah, and so that's the downside, because people want to know, how do you create this? And you go and you look here, well, we need something that can create an energy density of 10 to the 16 joules per meter cubed, which I imagine is a lot, especially because I believe breaking the Schwinger limit is like 10 to the 32 or something like that. So these are going to be very powerful lasers. But if we can get some very powerful lasers, this is where you probably saw my clip if you're watching of the dark energy laser. This is essentially what I'm talking about, is that you don't necessarily need to create a huge warp bubble. Even if you have a laser, a very focused one, this is potentially how you can create a geodesic in your path. Now, real quick on this last paper, I just want to bring up the idea of a traversable wormhole. So a couple things that were brought up on this paper, and I won't even go through it here. I'll just list them off. Is first of all, the idea of ER equals EPR that we bring up, which is Einstein-Rosen bridge equals Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen. Quantum mechanics, quantum entanglement are equivalent to a wormhole. It talks about that they are humanly traversable. Like we said, there's no event horizon on these, so you can go through it, and it's going to be like going through a doorway. You're not going to have any gravitational forces that would rip you apart. But the travelers must not couple with the material that is being used to generate the curvature. And if you imagine the Philadelphia experiment, when people get stuck in the walls, like this might be a situation where we didn't do it the first time. It mentions that there might not be any time dilation effect, which is something we should talk about in a follow-up for sure, because I struggle. I think I don't know. I like our debate back and forth about what the time dilation stuff.
Fully, yes. Yep.
And yeah, and then that's pretty much it. The last thing is that there's this teleportation physics study that's out there as well that talks about the idea of VM teleportation by Eric Davis, which I think is what explains all of these things: wormholes, warp drive, stargates, everything out there. So, any last comments on that before we wrap it up?
No, I mean, I'm very impressed with how much you've learned in such a short period of time, to be honest with you. So I'm pretty good, man. You've basically covered everything that I didn't, and vice versa. So I think I know it's been a great stream, and I want to thank both you for inviting me on, and also for everyone in the audience who's been just absolutely fantastic.
Well, thanks a lot, Dave. And if you want to go ahead and plug anything else that you didn't plug already, I appreciate it, man. I appreciate your time as well.
Sure. Thank you so much. So if anyone's interested with any questions or anything like that, dave@phasehelix.com. Also, if you go to phasehelix.com as well, for anyone that is interested, serious inquiries pertaining to any type of remote consulting, in-person consulting, so on and so forth. Anyone interested in certain building some of these devices, albeit I will admittedly say that we only do it for private groups and for DoD associated groups because of the simply because of the financial strain that some of these resources are required for it to be built. With that said, though, there are many people as well that go to the website or reach out to me as well because they're just curious about simply learning, and we also provide educational packages and things like that. So if anyone is interested, feel free to reach out. But again, I want to thank you so much, Ashton, for having me on. And other than that, I'm fairly active on X. Certainly not the way that Ashton is in terms of providing just immense details into a lot of what he's learning. But at Podcast Z on X, and yeah, I want to thank you so very much for having me on.
Yeah, I appreciate you, brother. You're one of my favorite people on the planet. Love talking science with you. So just as a quick recap of what we talked about here today, guys, we talked about the idea of like an EM drive. We went through warp drive capability. We talked about cold fusion, free energy, how we can potentially conserve the law of conservation of momentum.
Yep.
But that thermodynamics is potentially violated, and we have the idea of opening up our system, and that conservation of energy probably will have to be rewritten, assuming this physics is real. And I think that we are hopefully being pioneers. I hope that people look back on these interviews one day and they go, "Wow, these guys had it figured out." And because I think that both of us want to do is help change the world for the better. So thank you, everybody who's out there. Thank you, everybody, for watching today, and you guys have a good one. Peace, everybody. Sick.
It's MH370 until you do some research. Don't talk to me. I'm going to find the truth while I sip this martini. Your opinion, it means squat to me. It's H370. Not all heroes wear capes. I wear glasses to see. I'm going to find the truth while I sip this martini. The trolls hate seeing me succeed, but guess what? H370.